History has whispers. Pages yellowed by time, ink faded by neglect, truths buried deep. In forgotten archives, beneath layers of dust and denial, some secrets wait. I've held countless journals, records of weather, trade, mundane lives, but this journal, it feels different. Cold, heavy, not with age, but with the weight of what it witnessed. Its cracked leather binds a horror that defied reason, penned by a man who documented the impossible. A man who recorded the song, this is his testament. His descent into the silence before the end. This is the journal of birds that sing only for the dying. The rain lashes against the window panes of this archive, not with fury, but with a weary persistence, as if weeping for secrets long buried. The air hangs thick with the scent of aged paper, dust, and the faint metallic tang of forgotten sorrow. It is here, amidst crumbling ledgers and the brittle ghosts of correspondence, that it was found. Not gold, not jewels, but a testament far more chilling. The Blackburn Journal. Bound in cracked leather the color of dried blood, its pages brittle as autumn leaves, it promised not knowledge, but a descent into a silence broken only by the most terrible of songs. Its author, Dr. Alistair Finch, a man of science, swallowed whole by the impossible. Its subject, a horror draped in feathers and prophecy. Avis pronuncia mortis, the harbinger bird, Finch's own name for them, but whispered in the fog-shrouded hamlet of Blackwater Fen, where this nightmare took root. They bore a simpler, colder epithet. The death singers, forget the comforting lies of myth, forget the sanitized horrors of fable. What lies within these stained pages is presented not as superstition, but as meticulous, terrifying observation. Finch arrived in Blackwater Fen in the damp autumn of 1887, a man already haunted, though he knew it not. Grief was his companion, sharp and recent, the loss of his young wife Eleanor to a swift, cruel consumption. He sought solace, not in prayer, but in the rationale, the catalogued, the known. The Royal Society had commissioned him, a respected ornithologist with a penchant for the obscure, to document the unique avifauna rumored to inhabit the vast, treacherous salt marshes surrounding the isolated village. Blackwater Fen clung to the edge of the known world, a huddle of gray stone cottages perpetually slick with mist and the reek of peat and salt. Its people were carved from the same grim landscape, taciturn, watchful, their eyes holding the flinty hardness of those acquainted with hardship and the sea's capricious appetite. They spoke little to the outsider, this tall, gaunt man with eyes shadowed by loss and the intensity of the scholar. They warned him, obliquely, about the marshes, about the mists that could steal a man's bearings and his sanity, about the peculiar birds. Finch, rationalist to his core, dismissed it as peasant folklore. His equipment, brass telescope, specimen jars, sketching pads, the finest field microscope money could buy, was his shield against the irrational. Lodged with the village schoolmaster, a weary man named Mr. Hargrave, whose own eyes held a deep, unsettling reserve when the marshes were mentioned. The journal begins conventionally enough. Meticulous descriptions of common reed warblers, the majestic flight of marsh harriers, the intricate structure of a sedge warbler's nest. The prose is precise, detached, the hand steady. Then, subtly, the entries shift. A note of unease creeps in. October 12, 1887, observed a small passerin, hitherto undocumented, size approximating that of a common starling, but slighter. Plumage, an unsettling iridescence, shifting between deepest charcoal and an oily bruised purple under certain light. Beak, slender, needle-sharp, obsidian black. Eyes disproportionately large, possessing an uncanny, almost sentient gleam, remarkably elusive. vanishes into the reeds with preternatural silence. He sketches it. The drawing, even rendered in Finch's precise hand, radiates wrongness. The eyes dominate, pools of darkness holding a knowledge no bird should possess. He names it provisionally. Avis ignota funebris, the unknown marsh bird. The unease deepens with proximity. October 18th, 1887. Heard the song for the first time today. It's mid-afternoon, though the thick fog rendered it perpetual twilight. A sound unlike any avian vocalization in my extensive experience. It's not melodic, not a call. It was a crystalline chime. Pure, high, impossibly resonant, seeming to vibrate within the very marrow of one's bones. Yet beneath the purity lay an undercurrent, dissonance, faint but pervasive like the faintest crack in fine porcelain. It induced not peace, but a profound cold stillness, a suspension of breath. Mrs. Gable, hanging, washing in her meager plot, froze mid-motion, her face draining of all color. She crossed herself violently and fled indoors. The song ceased as abruptly as it began. Silence, thicker and more oppressive than the fog, descended. Finch, the scientist, is intrigued, fascinated. He redoubles his efforts to track the creature, spending perilous hours waist-deep in the sucking mud and razor-edged reeds. He sets traps, humane ones, designed for capture and study. They remain unsprung, yet the faint, unnerving scent of ozone and something vaguely metallic, like old blood, lingers near them. The villager's reticence hardens into open hostility. Whispers follow him. Doors close a little too quickly. Then the first death. October 25th, 1887. Old Tom the fisherman. Found cold in his skiff at dawn, tangled in his own nets. Face frozen in an expression not of terror, but of profound, unsettling peace. A peace that chills the blood. Mrs. Gable, wailing at her doorstep this morning, claimed she heard the crystal bells just after midnight outside Tom's cottage. Clear as chapel, she sobbed, clear and cold. Coincidence? Superstitious fancy linking unrelated events, yet the timing, the song heard, the death occurring shortly after. Da-da-da. A morbid correlation noted by the fen folk, undoubtedly. But correlation is not causation. I must remain objective. But objectivity begins to fray. Finch notes the uncanny peace on Tom's face, so unlike the usual rictus of drowning. He records the villagers' absolute certainty, their grim acceptance. Finds himself listening, not just observing, straining his ears into the damp, salt-laden nights. He starts marking instances of the song in his journal, meticulously noting the time, location, and atmospheric conditions. And then another. November 2nd, 1887. Young Lucy Miller. A child of 8. Wasting sickness, the doctor said. Expected yet. The song. Heard by her mother Martha, moments before Lucy drew her last labored breath. Martha described it not as beautiful, but as the sound of ice breaking over a dark pond. She is inconsolable, not just from grief, but from a terror that has sunk its claws deep. It came for her, she whispers, rocking back and forth. It sang her across. 2 instances. 2 deaths preceded by the song. Statistical probability dwindles. Pattern, horrifying in its implication, begins to emerge from the fen mist. Rationale battles a dawning, east-cold dread. What manner of creature is this? It's not a mere bird, a chronicler, a herald, or something far more active? The very air of Blackwater Fen feels charged now, heavy with unspeakable anticipation. Every rustle in the reeds, every drip of moisture, feels like a prelude. To the chime, I find myself. Listening, always listening. Mr. Hargrave watched me today as I returned, mud-caked and shivering. His gaze held no curiosity, only a deep, weary pity. "Do you hear them yet, Doctor?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper over the wind. The birds that sing only for the dying. The weight of the village's dread settles onto Finch's shoulders. His meticulous entries begin to show the first faint tremors in his handwriting. The shield of science is cracking. The Death Singers have found their chronicler. Finch's world, once governed by the precise taxonomy of Linnaeus and the comforting hum of the microscope, began to curdle. Blackwater Fen wasn't just isolated, it felt separated. The constant mists became a shroud, the sucking mud of the marshes, a hungry maw, and the silence between the village's sparse, functional sounds. The clang of a hammer, the cry of a gull, became a suffocating void waiting to be filled by that sound. His journal entries, once models of detached observation, now bled with a feverish intensity. The ink seemed darker, the script tighter, anguished. He stopped attempting Latin classifications. He simply called them them. November bled into December, bringing not festive cheer, but a deeper, wetter cold that seeped into the bones of the cottages and the soul of the village. Death, never a stranger to such a place, walked with heavier footsteps. Young Lucy Miller's tiny coffin was barely in the frozen earth when the next chime sounded. Finch recorded it with clinical horror. Asterisk, December 7th, 1887. 3:17 a.m. Wind. North-northeast. Moderate. Visibility. Near zero. Fog. Song duration. Approximately 8 seconds. Location. Vicinity of the old churchyard. You didn't need to wait for the village crier. By dawn, news spread like the creeping frost. Silas Crow, the ancient, half-blind sexton who'd tended the graveyard for 60 years, had been found stiff in his chair before a cold hearth. Not peacefully, like Tom the fisherman. Silas's face was locked in a rictus of profound shock, his sightless eyes wide, staring at the window as if he'd seen the face of God or the devil. And clutched in his gnarled hand, Finch noted with a shudder he couldn't suppress, was a single, impossibly dark feather, slick as oiled onyx. The feather became Finch's obsession. Under his microscope, it defied logic. The barbules weren't merely iridescent. They seemed to shift color depending on the angle of light, revealing fleeting, impossible patterns, like minuscule, screaming faces or twisting symbols that hurt the eyes to focus on. The central shaft was cold to the touch, unnaturally so, and seemed to absorb the light around it. It wasn't keratin. It felt alien, phallic, yet organic. He sketched it endlessly, his hand trembling, the lines becoming frantic, searching. His rational mind screamed contamination, delusion, mass hysteria, but the evidence, cold and wrong in his specimen jar, mocked him. The villagers needed no microscope. The feather was proof absolute. The Death Singers weren't omens. They were agents. Fear curdled into a kind of dreadful ritual. People began marking their doors with crude chalk symbols, spirals and crossed lines, charms against the song. He spoke in whispers, eyes perpetually scanning the gray skies. Children were kept indoors after dusk. Finch, once merely an outsider, became a pariah. His presence was a magnet for them, they believed. His scientific curiosity was a blasphemy, poking at forces best left buried in the peat. Only Mr. Hargrave, the schoolmaster, maintained a strained civility, though his gaze held a deeper sorrow, a knowledge Finch was desperate to grasp. "Tell me, Hargrave," Finch pleaded one evening, his voice raw from sleepless nights and swallowed terror. They sat in Hargrave's cramped, book-lined parlor, the fire struggling against the pervasive damp. These birds, this song. How long? What are they? Hargrave sighed, a sound like dry leaves scraping stone. He stared into the weak flames, his face etched with centuries of Fen's sorrow. Longer than the oldest stone in the churchyard, Doctor. They are the Fen's breath. Its counterbalance. He spoke slowly, choosing words like stepping stones across a treacherous bog. Life thrives here, stubborn, against the sea and the cold. But life demands its price. The Fen takes. Storms, disease, the hungry mud, the Death Singers. They are the collectors. The singers are the final account. But how? Finch pressed, leaning forward. How does a song cause death, Silas? His face. Does the bell cause the hour? Hargrave countered softly, his eyes meeting Finch's, holding a terrible weariness. Or does it merely mark it, perhaps? Perhaps the song isn't a herald, Doctor. Perhaps it is the settling, the final note in a life's ledger. For some, like old Tom, drowning was release after a hard life. Peace. For Silas. Hargrave trailed off, his gaze drifting back to the fire. Who knows what his ledger held? What debts were called in? It's a song. It resonates with the truth of the end. For some, that truth is peace. For others, it is a terror beyond imagining. It shows them the sum of their life, the face of what comes after. That is the shock that took Silas. The explanation was worse than superstition. It was theology written in nightmare, natural order perverted into cosmic horror. Finch felt the ground of his rationality dissolve beneath him. He wasn't studying birds. He was documenting angels of death, auditors of the soul. His grief for Eleanor surged back, a raw wound. Had she heard such a song? A crystalline chime in the quiet of her sick room? The thought was of physical agony. Driven by a desperate need to understand, to see, Finch committed his gravest trespass. The old church, St. Cuthbert's, was rarely used, stone walls weeping with damp, its interior smelling of mold and neglect. It was also, according to fragmented whispers Hargrave hadn't confirmed, a place the death singers favored. On the night of December 21st, the winter solstice, the longest night, Finch concealed himself within the frigid, echoing nave. He huddled behind the crumbling remains of a rude screen, wrapped in a thick cloak, his breath pluming in the icy air. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the oppressive silence. He held his finest brass telescope, not to observe, but as a talisman of his former self, a reminder of the man who believed light and lenses could explain the world, or his past. The cold seeped into his marrow, doubt gnawed at him, foolishness, superstition, the despairing act of a broken man. Then, as the village clock tower, miraculously still functioning, groaned out 3 solemn chimes for midnight, it happened. No rustle of wings, no flutter in the shadowed rafters. The air itself seemed to tighten, to hum at a frequency below hearing, vibrating the ancient stones. Finch felt it in his teeth, in the pit of his stomach. Then, piercing the suffocating silence, impossibly loud within the stone confines, came the song. It wasn't distant this time, it was inside. High, crystalline, unbearably pure, resonating from the very walls, the altar, the air itself. It filled the church not with music, but with an overwhelming sense of finality. It vibrated through the brass telescope in Finch's hands, through the bones of the pews, through his own skeleton. Beneath the chilling beauty, the dissonance Hargrave had hinted at was now a physical thing, a jagged edge, a tearing sensation in the fabric of reality. It spoke of doors closing, of balances settled, of an end absolute and irrevocable. And Finch saw them, not with his eyes, which were squeezed shut against the terrifying beauty of the sound, but within the sound itself. Flashes against the darkness behind his eyelids, vast impossible wings of shifting void and bruised light. Eyes like cold stars holding the indifference of eternity, beaks not of flesh, but of solidified shadow. They weren't in the church. They were the church, the night, the song itself. Concepts given terrible, fleeting form. The song lasted perhaps 10 seconds, an eternity. When silence crashed back, it was deafening, heavier than before. Finch was trembling violently, tears freezing on his cheeks, tears not of sorrow, but of primal, soul-deep terror. He hadn't witnessed birds, it witnessed judgment rendered in sound. Stumbling out into the frigid dawn light, numb beyond feeling, he encountered Martha Miller, Lucy's mother. Her eyes, red-rimmed and hollow, met his. She didn't speak of trespass or superstition. She simply looked at him, her gaze holding a depth of knowing that mirrored Hargrave's pity yet cut infinitely deeper. In a voice cracked with grief and a terrible acceptance, she whispered the words that would sear themselves onto Finch's soul. Words he would later transcribe with a hand that shook so violently the ink splattered like blood. You heard them, didn't you, Doctor? You heard the singers. Now you know the truth. The song isn't for the dying, it's for the dead. And once you've truly heard it, you carry it inside you forever, like a bell that only stops ringing when you do. The church wasn't sanctuary, it was a maw that had swallowed sound and spat out terror. Finch returned to Mr. Hargrave's cramped attic room not as a man, but as a vessel cracked by revelation. The cold that clung to him wasn't from the December fog. It was the chill of the void he'd glimpsed within the song. Martha Miller's words echoed in the hollows of his mind. You carry it inside you, forever. He could feel it. A silent, high-frequency vibration thrumming beneath his sternum, a phantom resonance of the death singer's chime. The dark held only the memory of those impossible wings and eyes like dead stars. His journal entries degenerated into frantic scrawls. Ink blotted by trembling hands, sentences dissolving into fragments and jagged sketches of things that defied geometry. December 23rd, 1887. The bell breathes inside my chest. Hargrave watches. He knows. The pity? Worse than fear. He offers no comfort, only silence. He understands the bell cannot be unrung. December 24th, 1887. They are not of feather and blood. The microscope lies. The feather, it is a concept given shape. A shard of ending? I held a shard of ending. December 25th, 1887. Eleanor, did you hear it? In the quiet of the fading light? Did the crystal chime bring you peace or show you the abyss? Forgive me. I never listened. I never truly heard you. The villagers' fear of him curdled into something darker. He was no longer just a harbinger. He was marked, tainted. Whispers of feather-touched followed him, spat from shadowed doorways. Children hid at his approach. The isolation became absolute, a physical pressure. His scientific instruments lay abandoned, gathering dust. Pathetic relics of a world that never truly existed. Only the journal remained, his sole conduit to a reality unraveling faster than he could record it. The death singer's song seemed louder now, not in volume but in presence. He heard its echoes in the drip of water from the eaves, in the sigh of the wind through bare branches, in the frantic beat of his own heart. It was the background hum of the universe, tuned to the frequency of mortality, driven by a compulsion he couldn't name, part terror, part horrific fascination, part a desperate need to know the source of the bell within him. Finch did the unthinkable. He decided to find their nest. The villagers spoke of it in hushed, fearful tones, a place deep in the heart of the most treacherous salt marsh, where the land bled into the sea and the mist never lifted. A place called Gormire. It was suicide. Men vanished in the less dangerous fringes of the marshes, swallowed by the hungry mud, or lost to the disorienting fog. Gormire was spoken of only as a cursed place, a wound in the world. He prepared in the dead of night, stealing silently from Hargrave's house. He took only a knotted rope, a sharp knife, a futile gesture against what he sought. But comforting against earthly dangers, a water flask and his journal tucked inside his oilskin coat. The cold was brutal, biting through layers of wool. The fog was a living thing, thick and cloying, reducing the world to a gray sphere barely 3 feet across. The sucking mud threatened with every step, the reeds whispering secrets in a language of rustles and sighs. He navigated by memory of crude maps drawn from terrified whispers, by the pull of the phantom bell in his chest, and by something else, a deepening sense of wrongness that permeated the air the further he went. The familiar scent of peat and salt decayed into a stench of stagnation, of rotting vegetation undercut by that faint, persistent metallic temps. The scent of the feather, the scent of ozone over a fresh grave. Hours bled together in the gray monotony. His muscles screamed, his lungs burned with the cold, damp air. Fear was a constant companion, a rat gnawing at his resolve. But beneath it thrummed that internal bell, growing subtly stronger, more resonant, pulling him forward, like an iron filing drawn to a monstrous magnet. The ground grew softer, more treacherous. Ice crusted over patches of standing water that looked deceptively solid. The reeds thinned, replaced by skeletal, salt-blasted trees, their branches like twisted, blackened bones reaching from the mire. Then he felt it, a shift in the atmosphere. The omnipresent silence of the deep marsh wasn't just absence of sound. It was a pressure, a waiting. The phantom bell in his chest vibrated sharply, painfully. A tuning fork struck against his soul. He pushed through a final curtain of dripping reeds and froze. Before him lay Gormire. Not a nest as any ornithologist would recognize. It was a blasphemy against nature, perched atop a grotesque skeletal island of ancient blackened driftwood and bleached, knotted roots rising from the sucking ooze. The structure itself was woven, not from twigs or reeds, but from bones, rib cages interlaced like wicker, vertebrae strung like macabre beads, skulls, human and animal, staring with empty sockets, formed archways and grotesque buttresses. Long bones, femurs, and tibias formed spars and rafters. It was vast, larger than any cottage in Blackwater Fen, a cathedral of death silhouetted against the eternal gray. The air around it shimmered, not with heat, but with a sickly, iridescent haze, the same shifting, oily purple-black as the Death Singer's impossible plumage. The metallic temps was overpowering here, mixed with the sweet, cloying stench of decay and the sharp bite of ozone. Finch stood transfixed, his mind shattering against the sheer scale of the abomination. This was no bird's nest. It was a lair, a focal point, physical manifestation of the end. The phantom bell within him was a deafening roar now, vibrating his teeth, blurring his vision. He felt a presence, vast and cold and utterly indifferent, focused on him. He wasn't hidden, he was seen, known, driven by a madness born of terror and a final, desperate need for proof for himself, for the world that would never believe. Finch waded into the freezing, thigh-deep water surrounding the Bone Island. The mud clutched at his boots like greedy hands. Each step was agony. He reached the jagged base, slick with algae and something darker, viscous. He began to climb. The bones were cold, unnaturally smooth, humming faintly beneath his touch, with the same resonance as the feather. He climbed past leering skulls, through arches of ribs that felt like the gates of hell, his breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. He hauled himself onto a ledge formed by a massive interlocked pelvis. Before him, recessed within a dome woven from finger bones and shattered craniums, lay the heart of the nest. Not eggs, not fledglings. Resting on a bed of fine, downy ash that seemed to shift and whisper on its own, lay offerings. A tarnished pocket watch, a child's carved wooden soldier, a lock of gray hair tied with a faded ribbon, a single pearl button. And there, amidst these fragments of extinguished lives, gleaming dully in the sickly light, was something that stopped Finch's heart cold. Eleanor's locket. The small silver oval he'd given her on their wedding day, engraved with intertwined ivy leaves. The locket she wore constantly, even in her final fevered hours. The locket that should be buried with her in the quiet churchyard miles away from this nightmare. A sound tore from Finch's throat. Not a scream, but a raw animal keening of utter desolation. He lunged for it, his fingers closing around the cold metal. The moment he touched it, the phantom bell within him exploded. Not sound, but pure, annihilating silence. A silence that swallowed thought, swallowed feeling, swallowed him. It was the silence at the end of the song, the silence after the last breath, the silence of the void behind the stars. It poured into him, filling the cracks, extinguishing the last flickering embers of Alistair Finch, the man, the scientist, the grieving husband. In that infinite crushing silence, he understood. He understood the ledger. He understood the collection. He understood why Eleanor's locket was here. He didn't hear the villagers arrive. He didn't feel the first rock strike his shoulder, or see the hatred and superstitious terror contorting their faces as they stood at the edge of the mire, hurling stones and curses. He only registered the cold water as he lost his grip on the bone ledge and fell backwards into the sucking ooze of Gormire. The silver locket clutched like an anchor in his fist, the journal a sodden weight in his coat pocket. He sank, the hungry mud claiming him, the last thing in his vision, the vast, impossible nest of bones shimmering against the eternal gray sky, and the terrible, beautiful silence of the bell now ringing only for him. They pulled him from the mire, but not salvation, not life as he knew it. Finch was a revenant, dredged from the sucking darkness of Gormire by the very villagers who'd stoned him, not out of mercy, but out of a terror deeper than hatred. To leave a man, even one touched by the singers in that place, unthinkable. It risked disturbing the balance, inviting worse retribution. So they hauled his limp, mud-choked form back to Blackwater Fen, a sodden sack of broken sanity and bone-deep chill, or no visible wounds from the stones. The mud had cushioned the blows, the wounds were elsewhere. He lay insensible in Hargrave's spare room for weeks, racked by fever that burned with the cold of the void. He raved, not in words, but in sounds. Choked whimpers, guttural moans that mimicked the sucking mud, and, most horrifyingly, fragmented, tuneless attempts at the chime. High, cracked notes that scraped the nerves and sent shivers down the spines of those who dared listen at the door. Mr. Hargrave tended him with a grim, silent duty, his face a mask of resignation. The village held its breath, waiting for the inevitable tolling that would mark the doctor's end. But the song did not come. Not for Finch. The bell inside him, Martha Miller had said, only stopped when he did. His silence was the song now, perpetually ringing in the hollow where his mind had been. When the fever finally broke, it left behind not clarity, but a terrifying vacancy. Finch's eyes, once sharp with intellect and grief, were now windows onto a frozen waste. He moved like an automaton, responding only to direct commands with slow, deliberate actions. He ate when food was placed before him, drank when a cup was pressed into his hand, but the spark, the self, was extinguished. All that remained was a profound echoing silence within, and a single obsessive compulsion. The journal. He sought it out the moment he could stand, finding the oilskin-wrapped bundle Hargrave had salvaged from his coat, miraculously less damaged than the man himself. The pages were warped, stained with dark peat and brackish water, the ink blurred in places into Rorschach blots of nightmare. Finch clutched it to his chest like a lost child finding its mother. He found a dry corner of the attic, away from the window, away from the sky, and there, with a trembling hand that grew steadier only when the pen touched paper, he began to transcribe. Not new observations, not rationalizations. He meticulously, painstakingly began copying the entire journal from the beginning onto fresh. Dry pages he'd taken from Hargrave's school supplies. His script was different now. Gone was the precise, scholarly hand. In its place was a spidery, angular script, each letter etched with a disturbing intensity, the ink laid down thick and dark, almost carved into the paper. It was the handwriting of a man etching his epitaph on the walls of his own tomb. He worked in near total silence, day after day, pausing only when forced to eat or sleep. Hargrave watched, his pity now laced with a dawning horror. This wasn't recovery. It was a ritual, a binding, the villagers knew. The feather-touched was remaking the cursed book. It was an abomination. Fear curdled into a new kind of dread. They avoided Hargrave's cottage. Whispers spoke of a shadow book, a duplicate that would spread the fen's curse beyond the marshes. Pressure mounted on Hargrave. Get rid of him. Get rid of it. Finch, oblivious or uncaring, finished his transcription in the bleak heart of January. The new journal was thicker, the pages dense with that dark, angular script. He closed it, tied it with a leather thong, and placed it carefully beside the original, water-damaged one. Then he did the only other thing his shattered mind could conceive. He asked Hargrave for Eleanor's locket. It had been found still clenched in his fist. When they pulled him from the mire, Hargrave, with trembling hands, gave it to him, the cold silver a stark accusation in the dim light. Finch left Blackwater Fen at dawn on a morning choked with freezing fog. He carried nothing but the clothes on his back, the original Blackburn journal wrapped in oilskin, the newly transcribed copy, in Eleanor's locket. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't look back. He simply walked into the mist, following some internal compass only his broken mind could perceive. He walked for days, a spectral figure haunting the desolate winter roads, driven by one final tragic purpose. He found his way back to the quiet churchyard where Eleanor lay buried. The journey, impossible in his state, was a testament to the terrible focus the singer's touch had burned into his ruined psyche. He stood before her grave, a simple headstone already weathered by a year of seasons. The phantom bell within him was silent now, not gone, but merged with his being, a fundamental part of his stillness. He placed the original stained, water-damaged Blackburn journal carefully at the foot of her headstone, weighed down with a smooth riverstone. An offering an apology? Desperate attempt to bury the horror alongside her? Then, clutching the newly transcribed copy in Eleanor's locket, he vanished. Weeks later, a parcel wrapped in coarse brown paper and tied with twine arrived at the imposing London offices of the Royal Society. It bore no return address, only a postmark so smudged by rain and grime as to be illegible. Inside, carefully packed in wood shavings, was a journal bound in cheap new boards. Accompanying it was a single, tarnished silver locket on a broken chain, and a brief, unsigned note written in that same spidery, angular hand that filled the journal's pages. For verification, the account is complete. The ledger is balanced. AF. The journal caused a brief, scandalous stir amongst the Society's more adventurous members. Its contents were dismissed unanimously as the deranged ravings of a brilliant mind shattered by grief and the hardships of field work. The descriptions of the birds were deemed fanciful, the events in Blackwater Fen attributed to local superstition and mass hysteria, amplified by Finch's deteriorating mental state. The feather, cleverly manipulated specimen, likely from a common corvid, enhanced by chemicals or the observer's delusion. Gormire, a hallucination born of marsh fever and guilt. The transcribed journal, with its dark, unsettling script, was filed away in the Society's sub-basement archives under ornithological curiosities. Dubious field reports. A footnote in the annals of eccentric science? Eleanor's locket was catalogued separately, a melancholy trinket from a failed expedition. But here in this archive, smelling of dust and time and the ghosts of unheeded warnings, we hold Finch's original Blackburn journal, the one he left on Eleanor's grave. It was never buried. A groundskeeper, clearing winter debris, found it. Intrigued by the fine binding, he kept it. It passed through generations of indifferent hands, a curiosity, a macabre heirloom, before finding its way decades later into the collection of a minor noble with a taste for the occult. And from there, eventually, to this silent repository of forgotten truths. Open it. See the water stains like tears, the blurred ink like spectral whispers, the frantic later entries dissolving into madness. Smell the faint, persistent temps of ozone and deep marsh, still clinging to the pages after all these years, and ask yourself, which is the greater horror? The meticulously documented descent into a cosmic nightmare presented as science, or the cold, angular transcription etched with the terrible certainty of a man who had stared into the void and found his own reflection, a copy made not in doubt, but in dreadful final knowledge. Finch vanished after leaving Eleanor's grave. No death certificate, no grave marker.
Oh.
Did he simply wander until his body gave out? Or did the bell inside him finally, mercifully, stop ringing? But sometimes on the very edge of sleep, when the world is hushed and the weight of mortality presses, close one might imagine hearing it. Not a song for the dying, but the last fading echo of a man who became the silence after the chime. A silence that speaks volumes in the brittle pages of a journal found amongst the ashes of reason. The journal of birds that sing only for the dying, and the one man they compelled to listen and then to become the song. So the echoes of Blackwater Fen fade into the rain-soaked silence once more. and the unsettling weight of the Blackburn Journal settles back onto its archival shelf. Dr. Finch's descent into the heart of darkness. His encounter with the unspeakable truth of the Death Singers remains a chilling testament etched in fragile ink and profound terror. If this journey into the shadows, this unraveling of a forgotten horror, resonated with you, if the silence after the chime lingers in your own thoughts, your support would mean the world. A like lets the algorithm know these deep dives into dark history matter. Sharing this video helps others discover these unsettling chronicles. Subscribing ensures you won't miss the next descent into the archives where truth often wears a mask of nightmare. And tapping that notification bell means you'll be the first to hear when another carefully buried whisper demands to be heard. Thank you for listening, even when the silence spoke loudest. The shadows hold more stories. For those willing to listen,